The people who stayed behind in both towers on September 11, 2001, or waited too long before trying to leave, bore no responsibility for what happened to them that morning. They were instead twice victimized, once by the men who hijacked the planes and took so many lives, and once by the impossibly complex interplay of luck, guesswork, psychology, architecture, and more that is at play in any such a mass movement of people. Fear plays a role, so does bravado, so does desperation, but so do ergonomics, fluid dynamics, engineering, even physics, all combining to determine which individuals get where they're going, which ones don't, and which survive the journey at all. Ultimately, we're misled by our most basic instincts, the belief that we know where the danger is and how best to respond to keep ourselves alive, when in fact we sometimes have no idea at all. It's the job of the people who think about such matters to tease all these things apart and put them back together in buildings and vehicles that keep their occupants alive. It's the job of those occupants to learn enough about the system so that they have the sense to use them. To scientists studying complex systems, evacuees abandoning a building or city or disabled airplane are not so much humans engaged in mortal flight as data points on the complexity arc. On an ordinary day, 20,000 people working in a skyscraper or 500,000 people in a coastal city occupy the same spot on the complexity spectrum as air molecules filling a room, moving randomly and chaotically in all directions, filling all the available space more or less uniformly. They're very active, but also very simple and disordered. Send the same people on a stampede down stairways or onto highways and things quickly grow overloaded and grind to a halt, jumping to the other end of the complexity arc, robust, unchanging, frozen in place, but every bit as simple as the ever-shifting air molecules. It's in the middle of the arc where the molecules just begin to take some shape or the people in the tower just begin to move to the exits that true complexity begins to emerge. The best way to understand the elaborate manner in which people move en masse may be to understand the equally complex way water does the same, particularly how it navigates around obstacles or breakwaters. A foundered boat or a tumbled boulder in the middle of a rushing river turns even the most powerful current chaotic, reallocating its energy into increased swirling and churning in decreased velocity. When people are fleeing a building, a similar kind of chaos can be a very good thing. Designers of interior spaces have found that a perfectly useless post positioned along the path to a fire exit may actually help people escape. Give evacuees storming toward a doorway a little something to avoid, and you stagger their arrival slightly, allowing them to stream through the opening in a reasonably controlled flow, rather than colliding there at once and causing a pileup. The obstacles keep you at the top of the complexity arc, preventing you from plunging headlong to the frozen end. You create a little turbulence, says Santa Fe Institute economist John Miller, who specializes in complex adaptive social systems. By adding a little noise to the system, you produce coherence in the flow. The problem with the human beings as water particles idea is that it takes you only so far. Early fluid-based computer models that designers relied on to simulate crowd flow had a troubling habit of producing results that were simply too tidy. Put a single exit in an office and the computerized evacuees would flow through it at a particular rate of speed. Open a second exit somewhere else and the people would respond appropriately, with half of them choosing that new option and the flow at both doors adjusting itself commensurately. Put a breakwater somewhere along the route and things smoothed out even more. Certainly the programmers weren't fools. They would correct for things like accessibility and proximity of the exits, with more of the simulated evacuees choosing the closer, more convenient egresses. But after that, the software assumed the people would behave sensibly. This, of course, was nonsense. For one thing, people have different levels of decision-making skills, with some inevitably behaving more rationally than others. For another, all of us have a tendency to believe that the rest of the group knows what it's doing and thus will gravitate toward a more popular exit simply because other people have chosen it, even if the alternative is perfectly safe and much less congested. Every additional person who chooses the more popular exit only makes it likelier that the next person will select that one too. Finally, information tends to get distributed unevenly, with some people learning about an emergency first and acting before the others. Once all of this was written into the fluid-based programs, the simulations ran amok. A fluid particle cannot experience fear or pain, writes David Lowe, a civil engineer who studies evacuations at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh, Scotland. It cannot have a preferred direction of motion, cannot make decisions, cannot stumble or fall. Humans do all those things, and in the process make a mess of most models. In response to such problems, evacuation software has gotten a lot more sophisticated. Programs with such evocative names as Egress, Escape, and Exodus take into consideration everything from the nature of an emergency, fire, bomb scare, blackout, to the season in which it occurs, cold weather causing more problems since people have to collect their coats, which is not only time-consuming but space-consuming once the bulkily clad occupants of the building crowd into the stairwells, to the time of day, fewer people being in the building at lunchtime, for example, than at 10:30 in the morning, meaning that the midday evacuations will be quicker and smoother. Of course, computers can't model the existential terror that comes along with any evacuation, and programs like Egress are thus limited by their very nature. One place those limitations show themselves is in the evacuation stairway. Once frightened people reach the stairways that should take them to safety, things ought to get easier. To complexity scientists, emergency stairways are nothing more than what are known as relaxation pathways, outlets that allow pressure or an imbalance to be relieved. In this case, the pressure of a mass of people trying to descend from higher floors to lower floors and then spill out of the building altogether. Given that, the only thing that ought to count in a stairway evacuation is pure speed. Nothing or anything short of a stampede that will get the building emptied in a hurry is a good thing, but pure speed is hard to maintain. Much has been made in the years since September 11 about the announcement in Tower 2 that instructed workers to stay at their desks, something that undoubtedly contributed to some of the deaths that day, even though that was precisely the correct thing to do as far as anyone at the moment knew. The improbability of one building suffering the kind of violence that was done to the towers that day, to say nothing of two, called not for a wholesale evacuation, but for a so-called sheltering in place, taking cover precisely where you are and thus staying safe from the chaos and debris on the street below. What's more, ordinary fires don't spread instantly across multiple floors and aren't fed by thousands of gallons of jet fuel. Fireproof doors and localized sprinklers are designed to keep people on unaffected floors safe so that they don't crowd the stairwells and slow the people who are in real danger. Even in an unexceptional emergency, however, it doesn't take much for a smooth stream of downward-flowing evacuees to turn turbulent. For one thing, people from middle floors who enter the stairwell somewhere in mid-current can cause things to slow or stop. The delay flows back along the queue the same way a ripple propagates through water, or cars entering a highway briefly slow the ones closest to the on-ramp, causing a wave of tapped brake lights that may radiate miles back. Sequential evacuation is the best way to handle this problem, with people on lower floors leaving the building first and each higher floor following successively. But again, nobody pretends that people fearing for their lives would wait patiently at their desks until their floor was called, nor would it be wise in a situation like the September 11 attacks, when the towers themselves turned into ticking clocks and people higher up needed every minute of evacuation time they could get before the buildings collapsed on top of them.